So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Modern Art Oxford. Thank you all for turning out for this afternoon's event. We're really delighted to see you all here. And you're actually the first audience for A Slice Through the World. So this is a pre-preview before our actual preview this evening. So it's a really special occasion both to see the show and to hear from 4 of the artists involved. So thank you again for joining us. A Slice Through the World Contemporary Artists' Drawings is an exhibition held across 2 venues. It has been curated and organised in collaboration with Drawing Room London, who've recently moved to a new space very close to Elephant and Castle Tube. At Drawing Room, further works in the exhibition are on display by Ruby Oyinyechi-Amanzi, whose work is behind us here, Carl Handel, David Haynes, Ciprian Murisan, and David Musgrave. And so that part of the exhibition is on view in London until the 5th of August. And I'd really recommend going down to see that if you're in London, and it's a really great new space. So congratulations to Drawing Room. Their opening was on Tuesday, and it was a great success. So on behalf of Modern Art Oxford, I want to thank Kate and Mary from Drawing Room, the co-directors of the space, for this great collaboration, which I think is an instance where 2 institutions can work together to make a better and bolder show, and it's been really great to be involved in that, so thank you. I'll explain the format of this afternoon. Each of our 4 artists here, Massinissa Selmani, Kate Davis, Ian Keir, and David Musgrave, will speak for about 10 minutes here at the lectern about their works in the exhibition and some other works within their practice. And then we'll go into a discussion which will be chaired by Kate Macfarlane, co-director of Drawing Room, where we'll also welcome questions from the audience as well. So as you'll have seen, we're recording this discussion to be made available later on both Drawing Room and Modern Art Oxford's websites. So I'll be there with a roving mic to capture questions from the audience when you have them. So if you could please wait for the mic, it just means it can be captured for the recording. On a similar vein, it would be really helpful if you could turn your mobile phones to airplane mode, because sometimes their signals interfere with our speakers. So that's just a small housekeeping point. Thank you. While you're reaching into your bags and purses to do that, I'd like to promote the exhibition catalogue, which I've completely failed to take a copy of up to the gallery. But just imagine that I'm holding a book while I'm saying, we've produced a new exhibition catalogue for the show, co-published by Drawing Room and Modern Art Oxford, and it's available in the shop for a very reasonable, thank you. See, my artists are wonderful. A very reasonable price of £15, and it contains new essays by both myself and Kate and great reproductions of everything in both of the exhibitions. So it's really valuable if you're interested in drawing, which I assume you are being here today. So alongside the book, we've also got a small number of postcards available in the shop and quite a good range of artist books, so some of the publications that the artists themselves have been involved in recent years. I'll give that. So just a brief introduction from me before we get into our first speaker, Massinissa Selmani, and you have bios of all the artists in your handout on your chair. A Slice Through the World demonstrates the power of drawing as an incisive art form that really compels us to reconsider how we might perceive the world around us. And in the words of artist Nidal Shamek, whose work is here, Les Trois Poses de Fadel Sassi, on your right, drawing is not a means to explain the world, but rather to understand it. The 14 artists from 10 different countries that we have featured in this exhibition are united in their desire to interrogate not only what we see, but how we see. Each is committed to the tangible materiality of marks on paper, often in conjunction with found objects, photo transfers, or mixed media installations and techniques. The exhibition showcases a heightened attention to both skill and detail and testifies that drawing is far more than just a preliminary or preparatory activity. These are all highly finished works that utilize the commonplace tools of drawing, such as ink and pencil. The artists here explore both the material conditions of drawing as a medium and its ever-changing capacity to integrate other artistic and research and digital forms in our current age. The exhibition argues that drawing is in many ways trans-historical. It has the ability to connect the past with the present, and in fact, many of the techniques, skills, and research approaches to drawing from 500 years ago are still being deployed by artists today. And in the words of many of the artists in the exhibition, we need the past to understand the present, and many of the images and archives and photographic sources that have been drawn on are a real, I guess you could say, a sort of act of memorialization, an act to call us to stop, look, and reconsider our histories and the relationship between history and our current social and cultural conditions. Drawing today is radical, complex, and expansive, and perhaps we could say it's a rematerialization in the face of the virtual. We were inspired in part by the last show of contemporary drawing to take place at Modern Art Oxford, when it was then called the Museum of Modern Art Oxford in 1972. It was an exhibition simply called Drawing, but in square brackets, as if to be slightly uncertain as to the definition or role of drawing in artist practice. And that was at the moment where you were really at the height of conceptual and installation and land art in the UK and also internationally. And it argued, in the words of the two artists who organized the show, John Murphy and Peter Waldron, that this was an exhibition of work in which drawing is more of an end than a means to another medium. So they were challenging the orthodoxy of working drawings or wall drawings and preparatory, minimal and de-skilled vocabularies around the medium that were very heightened at that moment in 1972. And similarly, I think a lot of the artists today are arguing for a return to mark making and materiality in the face of our excessive consumption of easily produced and shared digital images. I'll leave my introduction there for just now, and hopefully we can go back to some of the ideas and themes in the general discussion later. But for now, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our first artist to speak, Massinissa Selmani.
Hello. So you can see four of my works here, are the four drawings here. My practice of drawing is, for me, related to the notion of a survey. I try also, I have to approach in my work. One of the most important is how to think drawing like documentary form. Drawing with confrontation with history, with the news, with actuality, with violence, with different parts. And also there's another part of my work which is really related also to the way how I grew up, and also how to talk about violence with adding absurdity and a lot of confrontation between comedy and tragedy. Maybe try different thing. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I want to show this work quickly because it was the first work when the color appears in my work, and it was one of the first time when I start to create drawings with mise en scène, with situations that are unlikely to happen. All the characters comes from newspapers, press newspapers from different countries, from different periods also. And all the characters at the beginning, they don't have any relation between them, and I try to create these situations. Every character comes with its own context, and in a lot of my drawings, the white space is really important. And this white space for me is related to all this context. When you bring them together, they disappear, and it becomes this white space. My work is not very loud. It's always minimal. I also obsessed by the idea to how to make art with the minimum of I don't know the word in English, sorry. Moyen. Someone speak French? Means. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and the other part is I was talking about this idea of drawing as documentary form. For me, it's also a really important part because it's probably during this part where I put more experimentation on the drawings to try to display drawing with a sculptural dimension, with a lot of also confrontation between drawing and different elements. This is a view of my last show at the Palais Tokyo in Paris. It was a project that I spent 1.5 years working around it, about one history that happened in Algeria. French anarchists were in Algeria in the beginning of the 19th century and made a whole project of that, about that, and the aim was how to have a review of history only with drawings. I used to don't use archives or video films or something like that, only by drawings and what I call drawn forms. So sorry, it's not easy. So some results are like this. With drawing is always in confrontation with different things. The question of tension also is very important in my work. Where there's this kind of lightness, which is also really yes, important. Yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here. I think I said too much thing, and I think I use all the word in English that I know. So thank you.
Can I get it to go just on the page, Stephanie? If I go, yeah, oh yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Hello, my name's Kate Davis. I don't have a very loud voice, so wave at me if you can't hear me. Can you hear me okay? Yep. So I'm showing 4 drawings in the first gallery space, and they are from the Disgrace series, and alongside the drawings I also made a video work. Disgrace came after this body of work, which is called Who is a Woman Now, where I'd taken reproductions of William de Kooning's woman series paintings and treated them as if they were figures in their own right, and so the MoMA postcard has to be folded to try and stand up, and the Taschen page is also sort of folded to try and be upright. And with these works, I'd been thinking about the art historical works that I'd been sort of told to look at art school, and the way in which they represented women and the female body. And so this work came out of a desire to try and question de Kooning's representation of the female body, and as did Disgrace. So these were quite labour-intensive photorealist works. The one on the left is one of the largest drawings I've made, which is sort of about this large, and I wanted it to have this physical relationship to the viewer. So Disgrace partly came out of a desire to try and make a drawing in a different way, in a way that wasn't so photorealist, and to challenge myself to see if I could make a drawing that was much more immediate and less time-consuming, and where I had less control over the drawn marks. So I was thinking about Modigliani as another figure who's sort of firmly entrenched in the art historical canon. Again, a male artist representing the female body at a time where I felt, as with de Kooning, that female artists' voices weren't part of the conversation. So I sort of wanted to open, these works are trying to open up a conversation about those representations. So I made the work by lying on the reproduction and drawing around as much of my body as I could fit on the page at a time, and continuing to do that until I'd mapped around my entire body. And so the result, as you can see in the gallery, is a kind of tangled web that is my drawing of my body, something which is much more sort of chaotic and messy and less contained than Modigliani's. So it was also a way of trying to investigate my ambivalent feelings towards both Modigliani and de Kooning, both of which I have a certain respect for their work as artists, and then I feel also sort of troubled by the way in which they have represented women. So that was kind of where that work started, and I hope that the drawings could reach a point where there's a breakdown between Modigliani's figure and my own, and it becomes difficult to sort of discern where one begins and one ends. So this is, I've often made work that responds to art historical works, or a work or a moment or an object that already exists and often exists in an archive. So this was an invitation from the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow to make an exhibition and respond to works in their collection. And I became interested in the works that are cared for and the works that aren't, and how the care or lack of care, what value system that has been based on, basically. So I found this in the Women's History collection, which was uncatalogued, and a lot of the objects in that collection, including this one, had been gifted to the collection, so they didn't have a monetary value, and they weren't being looked after in a way that other works were. And this was a small pamphlet of a Christabel Pankhurst lecture where somebody had scratched into the portrait of Christabel Pankhurst. So I drew the portrait with scratches and enlarged it so the portrait becomes almost life-size, and enlarged the cover. And with this, one of the things that I found interesting about redrawing something was that it allowed me to have this kind of leveling of the information that it contained, so that I was using the same sort of decision-making, formal, aesthetic thinking in terms of trying to draw that information, whether it was a scratch or a detail on the dress. So I found that interesting, thinking about how drawing sort of flattened the I suppose the meaning of some of that information, and I also wanted the drawing to have the sense of something that had been given a lot of time and attention, so how that then could begin to work against something that might have been quite a quick, aggressive gesture. So I had a solo exhibition at the Drawing Room called Not Just the Perfect Moments. And this is one of the pieces that kind of acted as an introduction to some of the works. The piece on the left is a drawing of a Wellington boot that's been turned into a camera by the artists Joe Spence and Terry Dennett, as part of workshops that they were engaged in with children and going into different community groups. I've been really interested in Joe Spence's work since first looking at it more seriously in 2010, and the Wellington boot on the other side was a kind of an introduction to sort of say, could I apply some of her methodologies from photographic processes to drawing? So this is kind of a question mark, as a lot of my works are, I think. So I began a series of works under the title Reversibility, looking at Joe Spence's work in various archives. And one of the things that she was doing with objects such as the Wellyflex camera was enabling people to look at situations, moments, everyday life in a way that hadn't been represented in the family album or through personal or public photography. So looking at grief, mourning, childcare. So I began a series of work looking at Joe Spence's work in various archives, so the places where it isn't normally looked at. And this is in Glasgow Museum's archive, two of her pieces. This is a drawing of one of her works in the Joe Spence Memorial Archive, which will no longer be there because it was at that time managed by Terry Dennett, who passed away last year. Have I got time to, yeah. This is another work that I made around the same time as the Reversibility Militant Methods, looking at the Christabel Pankhurst publication. And and I was thinking about the militant suffragettes' attack on Velázquez's painting, The Toilet of Venus, in the National Gallery in protest at Emmeline Pankhurst's rearrest. And she managed to cut through the glass and slash the canvas in 7 places. So I used a National Gallery poster and reproductions of the documentation of the attack from their archive, and kept photocopying the documentation of the damage and redrawing where her cuts had been with pencil. So the photocopies another photocopy, and each time we get a further stage away from the original, and it begins to sort of degrade the form, the body that's depicted, and then I continued to redraw the marks. So I had been talking to conservators, and I was interested in this, the way they talk about the state of reversibility, where they want to be able to take an object back to particular points in time. And I was thinking about that in relation to my own work, and so working against the way in which this had been treated by the conservators at the National Gallery. So rather than repairing the Velázquez, reiterating the marks that Mary Richardson had made, and this idea that that could be another original rather than a defaced original, rather than an addition, rather than taking away from something. But I think I should stop there.
Okay, I'm David Musgrave. There are 2 of my drawings in the sort of big space through there, and I'm not going to talk too much about drawing because the drawings are there. And what I want to do is sort of try and talk a little bit about the digital as it exists in my practice, and try and get back to drawing from that, because I realize it's such an important frame, and I think it's more than a frame, really. And what I'm going to do is something that I would not normally do, but because there's only 10 minutes, I'm going to ruin one of my films, which is called Studio Golem, by talking all over it. It's a silent film. If you want to watch this, you can watch it on YouTube anytime you want. Okay, this is going to look a little bit fuzzy. If you want to see it to its kind of full effect, you have to see it in its 4K glory in an exhibition situation. But because I signed the contract with Channel 4, they can do anything they want with it, including putting it on YouTube in a slightly lower res version. but anyway, this is a film that began as an imagining of something coming to life. I mean, that's something that most of my work is based on, this kind of magical thinking, really. That I can somehow make materials do something, sort of autonomously. So I made quite a lot of work that involves these sort of very simple stick figures made of tape, and it seemed like the sort of the ultimate iteration of that would be a tape figure that actually moves. This is the first moving image work I've made. I've since made a few. It's very, very slow progress for me. But something that's really key for me about this, and the reason I'm mentioning it, is because it began as drawing, and then it turned into something else, and then I think it's returned to drawing in a way. For me, there's no difference really between drawing and the digital. I think the digital is this sort of, I don't know, soup or sort of quagmire that we're in all the time. And as I'm talking, I'm being digitally encoded in all these different directions, as are you. It's become our sort of, it's like the atmosphere around things. And I actually really like that. I don't feel any particular affection actually for the physical, even though I work with physical materials all the time. I think the physical is something really intractable and quite inhuman. It doesn't care about you, the physical. You know, your body's going to break down. It doesn't care about you, the person that you think you are. In a way, the digital is a much more hospitable environment, I think, for human beings. But nevertheless, I keep returning to drawing in this very kind of direct and sort of quite sort of time-honoured way. I'm going to let this bit play out. Okay. Okay. You might have to help me again. How do we make this? Yeah. Okay. So I'll quickly show you the drawings, very, very quickly show you the drawings at the drawing room, because if I spend too long with them, you won't go to the drawing room. So that's yeah. This is a plane with suspended animal. It's graphite and paper drawing about sort of so big. You can probably just make out this kind of schematic animal sort of suspended in the middle of it. This is YouTube, isn't it, in the background? Ah, God bless autoplay. Okay. Gosh, it's very, very little from where I'm... Okay. Here, this is large plane, another graphite on paper drawing. And what you're looking at here, in case you haven't had a chance to see the drawing in the other room, is this is the whole drawing, so it's not a piece of folded card. It's a drawing of a piece of kind of folded, scored, and sort of battered card on a piece of white Fabriano paper. What's important about these drawings, and this one too, is that even though they use this sort of language of observational drawing, which is something I actually associate quite strongly with non-art drawing, actually with sort of scientific illustration, is that these are sort of imagined. They're kind of largely or wholly imagined sometimes. So they're a sort of documentary, almost a kind of an old-fashioned sort of drawn document of something which is actually completely ideational. It's just it's a fiction. And that to me is something that's very important about drawing and its abstraction, its sort of level of abstraction from the world. It allows something which I always think is the thing that I really want in my work, all of my work, whatever form it takes, which is something I call dreaming space. It's something which can be very, very precise, but it's not kind of closed in the way that sort of most forms of representation are. Okay, I want to talk about two other things. This is something which I didn't think I would talk about, actually, but I feel that I can't not talk about it. This is, I've never made any public sculpture, but this was a proposal for public sculpture that would have existed about 30 feet in that direction, but it doesn't. It was a rejected proposal. This is the sort of architect's sort of vision of how this area of Westgate would have looked, with my kind of badly mapped work on top of it. It was going to be made of Portland stone, sort of set into the ground. So it was a kind of a sort of tessellated sculpture, a sort of anti-monument, sort of sunk into the ground, something with no vertical presence at all. But this is it. This is the non-existence of that work, and I'm not showing this as a kind of, I don't know, some sort of demonstration of the kind of vicissitudes of a kind of an art career, but because this work does exist, that the fact that it's the proposal exists and my sort of intention as it's embodied in this digital drawing means that, you know, this site is haunted for me by this work. And by coincidence, I've just finally started reading Mark Fisher's book, Ghosts of My Life, where in the introduction he sets out this notion of hauntology, which he kind of gets indirectly from Derrida, and he sort of talks about how sort of intentions and virtual existences actually act, they have force. And I realized that this actually really exists for me, that this the presence or the non-presence of this sculpture is, I know, perhaps it's better than if the work did exist. No, I don't really think that. It would have been better if it did exist. And I want to talk about just finish by talking about two sculptures. Sculptures are really important parts of what I do as well. In the same way that proposal for a very large public sculpture would have been 50 meters long is really quite categorically unmonumental. It's a sort of sort of towering public sculpture. The sculptures I make tend to be extremely reduced, and they're usually much, much smaller than my drawings. So I really like this sort of inversion of the relationship of the kind of the slight drawing and then the kind of the massive sculpture or whatever, or installation that arises from it. For me, my sculptures get sort of smaller and smaller, more and more sort of impacted, but also tougher as well, I hope. So this is a work called Stick Figure Night from about 3 years ago, and it's tiny. It's about this big. And it's made of titanium. And it was extremely hard to make this thing. I kept seeing this surface. You can see it here. You see this kind of the surface of this Mac, and in all kinds of places. You have this sort of titanium effect everywhere. I was really interested in titanium as a sort of contemporary mythical substance. You know, it's like quicksilver or something. That somehow titanium embodies all these sort of neoliberal, sort of desirable qualities. It's kind of smooth and indestructible and super light, so you can get out of all those sticky situations that your culture has put you in with some sort of style. But to make this, the reason I'm including this is because I just want to come back to this idea of the relationship between the digital, the apparently digital, and the real, the sort of tangible, because this sculpture never left my studio. Well, actually, it went to Dalston to be scanned. It went about 5 miles. But it began as something which I made with this very kind of messy material, milliput, and kind of sanded it down and carved it and shaped it. But then it was scanned, and that was all the company who were in Florida needed in order to make this extremely tough, durable object. I sent them the scan. They made a mold out of ceramic, which I never saw. This was sent to China. It was cast in titanium somewhere in China. I've got no idea where. I never met anybody who did that. I've never seen a picture of the place where it was done. And then it was returned to the US. Then somebody polished it. Someone I've spoken to a lot on the phone I've never met polished it. And then it was returned here, and then finally this kind of sort of satin-like finish was put on it here. But if you know anything about sort of scanning, sort of current scanning processes, it's all about sort of dividing something up, sort of slicing something up into layers. So for me, this work is something that's been sort of translated into drawing, but it's a sort of it's sort of inhuman or ahuman form of drawing. It's a way of sort of rationalizing and dividing up the world in a sort of digital way. And I made a second sculpture. This is the last image I'm going to show you, using exactly the same material. This is called Damaged Head, and it's about sort of so big. And it's quite a freely worked sort of stylized head, almost a kind of cartoonish head that's been sort of impacted and kind of scored. And you really need to see this to make sense of it because it's so reflective. I didn't put the sort of satin finish on this one. But here exactly the same thing happened. It was scanned, and then it was sent to, this was done by a completely different process. It wasn't cast. It was made by this process called electronic beam melting, which is quite a new process. And something that excited me about that process is that everything is kind of, this material is reduced to points. It works a bit like 3D printing, where a kind of laser will sort of shoot out either side of some titanium powder, and it sort of sort of melts it together in little beads that then all join. So this, I hope, really sort of unified form has absolutely no unity at all. It's made of these kind of infinitesimally small kind of grains of titanium that join up to make this thing. And I think, I want to just sort of end just with the thought that that maybe drawing is at the root of the digital. I mean, I think that drawing is a sort of primary division. I mean, I'm looking at sort of David's drawing here, it's an absolutely explicit demonstration of that, isn't it? Like a drawing is on or off. It's like it's a mark or it's the ground. When you draw a line, something is one side of it or another side of it. I mean, these are so fundamental that they're sort of invisible, and maybe not that interesting in themselves. I mean, they need to be kind of brought to life in some way. But I can't help feeling that sort of primary separation into sort of on-off means that drawing is a sort of a deep history of the digital that now encases everything. Okay. Thank you.
When Stephanie talked to me about this show to begin with, I was making this show for Paris, for Musée d'Art Moderne, and it was for a very strange room. It was a hexagon, sort of irregular shaped hexagon room, and already I was having trouble thinking about this quite distinctive singular room in terms of a single project. And so this is, in a sense, a conflation of two projects that I've been thinking about. One is looking at Frederick Kiesler's Tooth House, which I'd been thinking about for quite a while. And it's a he's an architect, sort of mid-century architect, who had begun very much influenced by sort of a modernism, an architectural modernism from the 20s, that gradually he started to question and in favor of a more sort of earthbound, biomorphic, kind of magical idea of what architecture could be. And he wrote this sort of volume of drawings called Magic Architecture. In fact, it's a set of drawings and it's a thesis as well. So it never was published, but he within this sort of volume of Magic Architecture, there's something called Tooth House, which is just thinking about a dwelling as a tooth, as a kind of cavity, and this kind of in some part primal sense of what we might think architecture to be. And I was kind of interested in this desire, sort of mid-century, to sort of break open a notion of the rational that had been got attached to modernism with something that was of nature, of natural form, but also of the dirt, of the ground, of things like magic. And this hexagonal room, in that sense, suggested at least some part of what that could be in thinking about drawing. And so this project, in one sense, is a response to his drawings, which were just 6 very sort of roughly drawn biro drawings. And then the other project I was thinking about in relation to this room, I'd just been to Lisbon to see this building designed by Chaves da Costa, who designed this sort of panoramic restaurant overlooking Lisbon. And he was commissioned by the Estado Novo dictatorship, which was about to collapse in the early 70s. But this building, it was built at a time when there was a lot of these kind of panoramic restaurants. And it was a sense of what the view could be in terms of a sort of a statement of power, a statement of sort of surveillance of. Also, it was a luxury restaurant. It was a sense that this was a place that only a certain section of the society in Lisbon, the ruling society in Lisbon, could dine at. And after the regime's collapse, it remained there. It's a kind of, in one sense, it's a concrete, brutalist building. And it tried to continue as a restaurant for a while, but it gradually became a ruin. And is now, or was until recently, just a site of graffiti, of parkour, of impromptu parties, of different kinds of sort of gatherings, very different to its original intention. So in that sense, the building represents its past as a kind of utopian projection for this regime that no longer exists, as well as a ruin. But it also is asking a question, what does it do now? And how do how does one sort of think about this building now, and how is it used in relationship to the city? Because to just bulldoze it is kind of a bulldozing or a clearing away of history. But to gentrify it is also not desirable. And so it remains in this sort of state of a monument that is slightly anxious. So I was thinking about just the way that this room suggests a kind of a panoramic view, and different aspects of the building and what it could be was presenting itself. And at the same time, and I think probably why Stephanie was including me in this, thinking of me in drawing, and I haven't necessarily always thought of myself in relation to drawing, was that I was using these perspex sheets, which are kind of in themselves drawings. They're bus stop perspex coverings from the city, and gradually over time these things get marked and defaced and kind of burnt and scratched when people just stand at the bus stop waiting. And so in a sense they are surfaces that are not, people don't, it's not like conventional graffiti where you set out to make a mark on the surface. They tend to be the result of a kind of a waiting or a boredom or a more instinctive desire to make one's mark. And these things build up these traces and these stains. And so there was a relationship to the paintings I was making, which were kind of diagrams or just monochromes, sort of quite lightly sort of watercolored and pencil paintings underneath these already drawn surfaces. But when I said I haven't often thought about myself in terms of drawing, is because I suppose always been thinking more in relation to the architectural model, and a way of thinking, in terms of what a model might be. And I was thinking for this show, if I thought, really a model's relationship to a drawing, what would be distinctive about a model? What would be distinctive about drawing? Because this show, in a sense, as Stephanie said at the beginning, is a sort of a rethinking, or at least a response to an earlier exhibition that was really thinking about what drawing might be then and what drawing is now. In that sense, the work I've made there is again a conflation of certain aspects of this exhibition that continued, that actually didn't make it into the last exhibition, such as the film, and it felt that the film couldn't work in that show in Paris. But that's another kind of drawing in that it's it's using an iPhone just to re-look at this architectural model that you see in this work. And in a sense, if a model has different possibilities of representation, so you think about representation very simply as you make a model of something that's already in existence, that's very simply described, or a fragment of that thing. But a model can also be something where you're working out ideas and you're sort of experimenting in the present and searching for ideas. And then the sense of the model as a model of something like this model, this building, which is a sort of a utopian model, or an idea of really projecting an idea into the future, in that sense. So I was thinking what a drawing could be each of these things, and that perhaps this relationship of models to drawings is very close. Also that drawing tends to be, although this may be contrary to the notion of drawing as an end in itself, but very often drawings tend to be used in different disciplines very similarly to models. But maybe it's just a way of thinking, and yeah, I'd leave it there. Yeah.
So thank you very much for all of your contributions, and of course for your contributions to the exhibition itself. So I was trying to sort of think of a way of, first of all, maybe finding some, obviously there's 4 very different approaches to drawing and uses of drawing here on this this panel. One thing that seems to sort of tie the artists together is the idea of using drawing to kind of pose questions, to try and solve problems, and you know, whether these are, in Kate's talking about her relationship to artists of an earlier generation, Massinissa about things that happened in your youth, dealing with kind of violence of youth that you experienced at that time, and David's interest in how something is made. So with what's interesting with David's drawings, if you haven't yet seen them, they are made with paper and pencil, and their subject matter is the same. They're one and the same, just as he described with the animation. The interest there is in actually the process of making the animation and what an animation can do. So, and then Ian talking also about the relationship between drawing and models and working out ideas. So I think it is interesting to think about to what extent a drawing is something that's in process and to what extent it's finished. And I think, you know, a lot of the works in this show are very finished. They were like presentation drawings. They're very resolved. But I think there's also a very kind of close line. There's also a certain amount, always I think with in any drawing, there's also a certain amount of irresolution, if you like. And it's a kind of this point at which you stop. And I think, Ian, that's something that is interesting about your work in particular in this sense, is that it seems to, it's sort of, especially with that sort of breathing form that you have in there. Hopefully you've all seen the exhibition, you know what I'm referring to, but there's this kind of form that's has the kind of lightness of a pencil mark, if you like. And it sort of absolutely encapsulates that kind of key thing, which is drawing, which is that it's a kind of register of movement. And it seems to me that it's kind of the kind of gesture of drawing kind of completely, you know, laid bare and sort of left to waft in the room. And, you know, and absolutely kind of, I suppose one of the things that, you know, all of you would say, one thing that the exhibition is refuting or questioning is the idea of drawing being something very spontaneous, because everything in this exhibition is highly considered and resolved to a certain degree. but I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about, Ian, if you could just talk a little bit about the role of that element of the exhibition, of the installation that you've made.
I suppose it was made quite quickly in response to this room as well, and this kind of extraordinary space with the similar space to this, but with the ceiling, and this sense of something that's just drooping or sagging, and in relation to the steel framework and this kind of cable that works. So in one sense, there's a sort of formal or shape response to the room, and it of course goes back to Kiesler's sense of the sort of the unform and the sort of the different things that this thing could be, or what it could suggest. So in that sense, it's a response to the space of the room, response to thinking about these two projects that I was talking about, and a kind of it's also a redrawing of these things together in a way, and a stain as well.
Ah, yes. That's and that's carried. The stain is sort of obviously carried through to the paper that forms the backdrop to the plexiglass that you place in front of the sheets, which is what actually makes the marks, the scratches, the blemishes on the plexiglass. It makes them visible. Without those sheets of paper, they wouldn't be visible. So the other thing is, I want also, there was a nice link, although taking quite a different form, between Massinissa's work there and Ian's work, I feel, in the sense of there's a kind of, and I mean, I think it runs as well, there's a very interesting link, I think, between drawing and between poetry, and that idea that of if you're not having a definite kind of endpoint to something, that there's a kind of almost like a futility. I mean, Massinissa, with your drawings, it's like these actions are unfolding. There's a kind of futility to the vignettes that you draw. As he described, he's taking these different characters, plucking them from many different news stories, and they're not connected, but they kind of coagulate into a kind of poetic kind of movements on the page. Have you got any thoughts about poetry and futility?
Yes, of course. I grew up like that. With I was talking about comedy and tragedy. I really grew up like that. Like something happened, like very tough, and at the same time something totally absurd happened in the same time. So you don't know if you have to laugh or to be scared by this situation. So this is part of my background, and also when I start drawing and thinking about what is drawing, I look a lot about the press clipping and also the cartoons in the press clipping. When I was in Algeria, I had this every time when I was a teenager during the civilian war, the headlines of the newspaper were violent, but the first reflex it was to turn the newspaper, to see the cartoon, to laugh, and after that open the newspaper and see what's going on. So this, it's part of my background, and also I like to use a lot of absurd titles also from to my works. It comes from my readings. From different things, from French literature, Algerian, or all other things, and for me, it's a way to have kind of review of violence, but it's not a violence which is situated in a place or in a time. I talk about newspaper. I like to work from newspaper because never from internet. Because from newspaper, what I like is from the moment that the picture is taken from the event and its publication, there is a gap, kind of space where a lot of choices are made by the photographer and also the newspaper. For example, if a photograph take the photographer take the photograph and its newspaper reframe it, who is the author of this? Is it the newspaper or the photographer? So probably my work is between this. It's situated in this gap. This is why all the les mises en scène are suspended in the time. So maybe this kind of distance that gives, I hope, kind of poetry.
So again, and that idea of the time of drawing, but also Kate, with your work, you know, looking back to other artists, and it's sort of like you've tended to, most of the artists that you've done work around have been more historical figures that you haven't met, that you haven't got. You have worked, I know, with contemporary artists with, but one thing that I was interested in you talking about was that idea of in redrawing in the de Kooning, only when you were talking about the Velázquez, and no, the not the Velázquez, but the item that was in the archive, the suffragette manual, which had been defaced, and you redrew it, and the way that you were sort of using drawing as a kind of, there was a kind of leveling of information there. And it kind of, that also made me think of the way, David, you talk about how you've talked about using drawing as sort of something that kind of grows almost like a sort of, in the way that you described how your sculptures are made, so that they kind of just almost grow themselves. And you'll see when you look at David's drawings that there's very little evidence of individual pencil marks. So there's a very kind of slow, incremental kind of building up of the very, very hard graphite on the paper, so that they're completely kind of inflection-free. And so that I think one of the things you talked about, David, is this idea of kind of seeing if you can actually kind of repurpose this really sort of manual, physical act to make it almost seem that it's sort of produced mechanically. Could you say something about that?
Thank you. I wonder if I can. And I mean, I always find, I don't know if it's just a particular sort of theoretical education I've had, but I always tend to find the opposite of something in the something. And I realize it can be a bit of an irritating kind of tick, but I think in the end, I don't know, I can't distinguish between the manual and the technical, and the human and the technological. So, but what is it you want me to say? Yeah, unfortunately, I have to. Yeah, I have to do that bit. Yeah. Why? Because there's no other way of doing it, and even though it seems like a part of me sort of recoils in horror from the idea that some artificial thing could do what I do, and I don't believe it's actually ever going to happen. I think, well, actually, if I could do that, would I allow it to happen? And I would, actually. I'd be fascinated to see what some artificial thing could make on the basis of understanding what I do. I don't know if it's possible. But if it was, I'd press the button.
I was really interested in this tension that you're describing, because in the way, what we want to avoid is setting up some kind of opposition between the digital and the material. It's not what the exhibition is trying to say, but it's kind of easy to fall in those traps of kind of this oppositional language, as if somehow we're valorizing the handmade mark over the digital image or, the digital sphere. And I think David's articulation of drawing as somehow being a deep root of the digital age is in itself really evocative and really true. And as you mentioned, sitting in front of David Haynes' Meat Boy and Bob Starr, where you have this brilliant sort of visual exposition of that idea of the pixelated digital image, and then this hyper-real, almost trompe-l'oeil foreground drawing an incredibly detailed brocade fabric and incredibly detailed simulation of human skin. And at the end of it all, it's all simply graphite pencil on Fabriano paper. And I think that notion of sort of finding or articulating a shared space, and kind of what you're doing with your practice, David, is kind of probing the limits of where these types of marks and types of production meet each other. That to me is really valuable, because the sort of intrinsic hybridity or intermedial space of drawing is certainly not about artists deciding that it's in some way more valuable than the tools of a digital landscape, and nobody can make a work of drawing today with the idea that the internet somehow doesn't exist or digital image technologies don't exist. We're all working under that awareness in whatever we practice, whether it's writing or making work. So that just sort of feels an important point to make, that we're not in any way creating a negative relation to works of digital technology, but that it's something more strategic and almost conversational between these means of making images. Sorry, we have limited microphones.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a question really, why, which is, I suppose, what I was trying to get David to say is, why then do you still keep making these drawings, which are about drawing, and...
Sorry, I can't answer that. Because I still really care about human experience, and I think that's something which is so far completely inalienable. It actually doesn't really matter so much, I think, what else technologies can do. In the end, I have to have an experience that feels kind of compressed and sort of meaningful enough. And so far, nothing has done that apart from human beings. And I feel like I can, at the moment, I'm only satisfied with something which is the kind of the sum total of a lot of kind of judgments and instincts and intuitions and understandings that that I have, and drawing can do that in this really economical way. I mean, it just all happens in this with these very, very few materials.
Well, I just, when you were saying before, Kate, about drawing sort of, do you say, kind of not lacking resolution, but not, I suppose, having that sense of closure. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in drawing, this idea of the drawn mark as a proposition and a way to see something that I haven't seen, but would like to see, or feel like, what would it be like if that had been seen in 1950, whatever, or but also, yeah, I was thinking that maybe that sense of lack of closure comes partly from just the everybody's understanding of a pencil. You know, I know drawing isn't just using a pencil, as the exhibition shows, but just that it, like you were saying, David, you know, that really sort of fundamental nature of something, the line and something either side, and the sense that you can erase it. I think that brings a a sort of energy that painting doesn't have that same sort of tension that something could be. It can be a scribble and it can be erased, or for me, that's gives drawing an exciting energy, the sense that you're putting forward an idea of something without needing it to be pinned down or final. It's like a stage, enter into, I suppose that's what I mean by proposition, something that the audience can enter into, start of a conversation. I think drawing lends itself to that.
Yeah, thank you. The other touchy thing I thought I should bring up was this whole idea of labour and craft, and I thought that's particularly interesting in relation to Ian's work, because it's like Ian's work is almost like a sort of defiance of the idea of labour, in the sense that he's working a lot with the found the found mark, which in itself is unlaboured because it's unintentional, accidental. Yet, of course, we know that Ian's work is actually very labour intensive in despite it doesn't appear to be labour intensive, but it is indeed from the very the time consuming process of actually gathering a lot of the found elements that you use, and then the close attention to the obviously the display of them, but also the paper that sits behind the plexiglass sheets is very carefully sourced. It's been soaked in ink. It's joined at strategic points to make it exactly the right format. The edges are just left in exactly the right way. They're torn. They have to be torn in the right way. So I just wondered what you feel. What's your attitude to the idea of labour and craft, Ian?
I'm not very interested in it. I'm interested in labour, but not in a virtuous notion of it. In that, I'm very happy if a piece of paper could fall on the floor and it becomes interesting in some way. That's very wonderful. So I'm as much interested in action and not doing things as doing things. Labour, very often it's tied to intention and will, and this idea that with labour you are achieving something that you set out to achieve. And I think very often that doesn't happen in relationship to art. But there's different kinds of labour as well. There's the labour of thinking. There's the labour of arriving at something by accident as well. So it's an important part of a process, but I wouldn't ever promote it. Yeah.
Stephanie, do you think we should open it out to the audience? So I don't know if you have questions for the artists.
Hi, I've got a question for David. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the dreaming space that you were talking about, that you feel, or you hinted that drawing leaves slightly more room for. I was just wondering what you meant by that, and maybe why you think that's valuable.
I think it's valuable. I don't think it's unique to drawing, and I actually think it's really rare. It's because I feel there are, we're in a world full of images and messages and codes. Like everything is just sort of dense with kind of codes, but there's no freedom in it. When I go up the escalator to the tube, it's funny, if I've been away somewhere where there's very little kind of signage, I actually feel attacked by the number of posters on the tube, like the number of messages. And I think we just sort of get used to it. I know it's like an exercise regime or something. Like you can just kind of bench press a bit more all the time. There's more and more codes and messages, and that to me is not. It's not in my interests. It's not in human beings' interests. It's in the interests of capital and commerce. And that's why we're asked to do it, to interpret all these messages all the time. I'm only really interested in art's capacity to just to kind of hit my my sort of being at some other level, like dislocate something or just enable me to feel things a bit differently. So that's what I mean by dreaming space. It's like some non-channeled way to, but there's a kind of perversity about it, because the only way I can get there is by doing something extremely rigorous. It's like only once I've sort of set up these terms that I fully understand and that I can barely move in them, then I feel like I can just open it up. I couldn't just do anything. Right? Can I just say, in relation to labour as well, that my favourite work of art involving a lot of labour is Robert Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing. Yeah, that's labour. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for all the comments, really interesting. It's another one for David. You said in your presentation you felt the digital was hospitable. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that concept of digital hospitability.
Well, it's just so plastic. You can do so many things with it. Like, its potential is amazing. I mean, obviously it's been hijacked by all these interests which we can't do anything about. But it's not that really the digital's fault. You know, I think the digital still has that potential, and you can still find it in odd places. And I think I don't see why you can't do that as art. There are a lot of artists that I really respect who use sort of digital media, but I sometimes feel it's just like a sort of wallowing in the misery of what the digital has become. I think actually no, it's sheer wish fulfillment, and it has this amazing speculative potential that Kate was talking about, that drawing has. It's like, you don't actually have to do it. It's enough to speculate and to kind of draw the map or the plan of it. And it's there, you know, it exists. And I think in that respect, the digital is part of drawing. It's part of that sort of economy of proposing something which just doesn't exist yet.
This is for everyone, I suppose, because I come from a different art background. So I'm interested in, do you think about your audience? Does that in any way start your process, come anywhere in your process? Do you care how audiences interpret your work? Or, yeah, so I suppose because I come from an art form that is all encompassed by audience reaction, I'm interested in what you feel about that.
Yeah, of course, yes. But for me, I accept that idea that the works, I mean, they don't belong to us at the end. At the time it hangs on the wall, on display, on the space, you cannot control what people think, or everyone comes with its own background. Sorry, I was going to say something really smart. I just forgot it. Yes, I remember. Because also, for me, when I work from newspaper, there is something really that interests me a lot. It's when I take some character, you have some gestures that are familiar to everybody. So if you have, for example, someone running in you can imagine that it's a riot or something like that. But if I took it and put it in another situation, with very simple situation, maybe give to this character, so I remove it from its own context, put it in another context, and maybe create another levels of reading of this supposed event or not.
Yes, as much as I'm really interested in making the work in the studio, what I most want to do is make exhibitions. I want to think about the work in relation to a space, in relation to a viewer. That's what I'm really interested in. So, yeah, absolutely, I would say. But at the same time, I suppose the work is, you're listening to feedback, but you're also, needing to take on board certain things, but pursue your own ideas and
I'm just really interested in your question as to why you're asking it. And yeah.
So, yeah, I suppose if an audience member looks at your work and their feedback is that it isn't what you intended or what you see, does that matter to you, or does it stand in the space of itself? Whereas in theatre, I think, yes, you can't dictate what an audience will feel or react to, but you are much more interested in that relationship between performance and audience. So I'm asking that as in terms of visual artists.
Yeah. I'm certain that as soon as I answer this, I'm going to think of other things that I should have said, later as I walk away. But really, one cares, or I really care about what people think, and I want people to be interested in like this thing, But the almost always when I set out to make a work, or I have an idea about how I'm going to make this thing, never does it work out, So if that's my relationship to this thing, I can't expect my ability to make anybody else respond in the way that I would like them to respond. So in one sense, that is inevitably what's going to happen. But also, I think it may be something to do with intensity, because there are different kinds of intensity and time. And I'm interested that time is actually running all the way through this show. And it's a different kind of time to performance time. And I think, someone said to me very early on that being an artist in studio, in one sense, is the most boring activity you can think of, in that you're looking at a white wall in this space on your own for a rather long time. And how can that be interesting, in one sense? But there are different kinds of intensity that I think everybody's interested in, and anyway.
Just maybe, I think that, what Stephanie and I hope audiences will take away from this exhibition is that every work does demand some sort of response. We definitely see drawing as the medium that sort of slows down perception, or it leaves many questions. It doesn't just present everything on a plate. It hopefully, as all of the artists in the way that they've made the work is about solving problems, so they're giving you, the audience, a problem to solve as well. And I think that one thing that also is consistent with the way that drawing was perceived in the 1972 exhibition, which was very much that drawing is about the execution of ideas, the exploration of ideas. And so one of the things that we're kind of wanted to kind of emphasize in this exhibition is that there's the modes of drawing used in this exhibition are very different from those in 1972, but all of them are involving at that level of cognition, and to both on the part of their maker and hopefully inducing that in the audience as well.
I think that's a really important point to end on, and I just want to kind of follow that by saying that a lot of the artists have alluded to the I guess you could say, the inherent interdisciplinarity of drawing and the fact that it exists in lots of other professions, so architecture, design, engineering, mathematics. And I was talking about it at the beginning as a kind of borderless hybrid space, and I want to make the point that that's also in relation to this supposed division between the arts and the sciences. So drawing doesn't respect that they have a difference or a boundary between them, and we're in this moment where art subjects are being completely devalued in our curriculum, and actually it's a completely false distinction to say that somehow you must only study maths, the sciences, English, and art subjects are not worthy of a place within the new EBAC system. So I suppose drawing to me is the best argument that that is an incredibly false division that's being set up, and it's going to produce the next generation of people who just haven't learned any manual dexterity or problem solving or reasoning through the ability of learning the process of drawing. And that's not necessarily learning to draw in a particularly skilled way, but that idea of being able to think and resolve creative processes through the practice of drawing. So not to end on too political a point, but it feels important to say because we're in this moment where drawing and the arts in a more wider sense are under threat by our current government, who seem to think that they have no value to education or indeed the economy, and that is very troubling for me, and I know a lot of my colleagues as well. And I think the 4 artists today are the best example of why that's such a dangerous path to be going down. And yes, I suppose we should sort of finalize now and finish by saying thank you to the 4 artists and to Kate for chairing the discussion and to you for your questions. Thank you.